Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. I'm Krista.
I'm Kristen.
And we are the Sixth Sense Society. Welcome to another episode of the Sixth Sense Society. Tonight we are going to be talking about a most fascinating topic, and that is magical battles. So first, however, we're going to talk about the cosmic weather. Tonight we are in a waxing gibbous moon in the sign of Scorpio. I think that's appropriate. Tuesday on the 26th, we have our last quarter moon in Sagittarius, 7 degrees 34 minutes at 3:28 a.m. And also that morning, Venus goes into the sign of Aquarius. The big news on the cosmic front is Chiron is now in Aries. It just went in, I think, about 4 days ago. And it's going to be in Aries until 2027. So you're going to have plenty of time to get to adjust to it. And if you haven't experienced it before, and many of us have. And I wanted to, it actually spends the most time either in the sign of Pisces and Aries, so it is certainly a little bit longer than normal. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, quickly, the mythology of Chiron, just in case some of you don't know it, because in astrology, it is really important to understand where some of this information comes from, and it comes through a lot of it mythology and archetypes. And I got my information from a great book called Chiron and the Healing Journey by Melanie Reinhardt. I highly recommend that book. So she talks about it briefly, the myth, and actually a little more briefly, but I'll be brief. So he was the son of Saturn, and the nymph, I think it's pronounced Philyra. He was abandoned by his father and rejected by his mother when she found out he was a centaur. She actually, this is kind of odd, she pleaded to be turned into anything other than herself, and she was turned into a linden tree. Apollo became his foster father, however, so that was pretty cool, and teacher. Reinhardt writes that, quote, Chiron became a wise man, prophet, physician, teacher, and musician. He was a mentor to many famous Greek heroes like Jason, Achilles, Hercules, and Chiron taught them everything from riding, archery, hunting, the arts of war, and medicine, all survival skills, to ethics, music, religious rituals, and the beginnings of natural science. Chiron is associated with the principle of homeopathic healing. So most people know Chiron because he was wounded in his leg and it would not heal. And he was accidentally, at least one of the versions that's popular, was wounded by Hercules' arrows. He was trying to shoot some other centaurs. So the way he finally was relieved from his pain, Chiron, he took the place of Prometheus and died, and then, however, he was placed in the constellation Centaurus. So that's a little bit about the mythology, and I'll take a little break here and have Kristen talk a little bit about what she thinks about Chiron and Aries.
Well, it's interesting because in some of the research that I've been doing a lot, I discovered that Chiron is a dwarfed planet. And it could be absorbed by the sun, or will be absorbed by the sun at some point. It's not meant to be with us forever, which I think is really interesting because it is associated with healing, self-realization. And it's interesting to me how it's with us at this period of time for a reason and to take advantage of it. I think we talked about the last time Aries and Chiron were together was in 1968. And it's interesting because part of what Aries is about is the masculine. And perhaps there could be some deep healing with the masculine. I read a very interesting article where they mentioned perhaps something could come up besides the Me Too movement that's about healing of the masculine in a positive way. Not to take away from, of course, everything that's amazing that's happening with the Me Too movement and why the Me Too movement is so important to women, but also to men. But there is a lot of healing that has to be around, I also think, the masculine energies. And it could be very interesting if Chiron, in a very masculine sign, could potentially bring that up. Something else that I thought was super interesting, 3 days of the last 1968, the last transit from Chiron into Aries, Martin Luther King was shot, and then followed by a few months later, John F. Kennedy. So it could be very interesting if if something like that, if that pattern repeats, given that Mars is can be a very volatile planet. So looking at healing, perhaps violence, and looking at violence and what violence is potentially about. Aries is a very much of a maverick, and a maverick is the cow that
I read this too.
that won't be branded, which I just think is really, I love it. It's fabulous. So it's very much about, I will not be branded. So with everything else, I know we do think a lot of Chiron as the wounded healer, and there's just so much information about that we're not talking about that so much here today. And I love that Krista went into the mythology of it. But I love that it's, I will not be branded. Maybe that should be your new mantra.
Yeah, and that concept of the self-realization was pointed out in Richard Knoll's book about Chiron. I wanted to point out that it's also connected to Chiron and Aries, trailblazing and pioneering and innovation. And this could be in certainly different areas. It could be creatively. It could be also, I think, in medicine, especially I would think around the brain or the head or head injuries or trauma. I really liked what he had to say in his book, Chiron, the New Planet in Your Horoscope, about Chiron and Aries. He said that they are oriented towards anticipating the shape of things to come and seek to leading the world, kicking and screaming if need be, into tomorrow. And one of the things I have Chiron almost on my ascendant. So Chiron's pretty important in my chart, and I don't know why people never talk about the fact that he was a teacher, and that his wound really came later in life. And the other thing about his wound was he endured it. He didn't complain, And I've heard people, lay people talk about, oh my God, Chiron is conjunct by some sun, poor me. And I thought, well, Chiron didn't handle it that way. He tried really hard to heal it, but also he was a very educated. He was different from all the other centaurs, and I think that even astrology sometimes has this lopsided energy when it comes to the mythology of it. Now, I saw some people had talked about more about him being a different kind of centaur and the union of the intellect and the bestiality in us, kind of. Someone had talked about that, but I went through Chiron return, and once I kind of figured I was going through it, it was a really interesting and not a dramatic time. Right. And I think Chiron taught me things. I think that part of him being a teacher is really, really important. And don't just think of it as the wounded healer, because that wasn't most of his life, in the mythology. And he overcame his childhood wounds because, he did become a great man. Right. So even though he was rejected by his his mother, and banded by his father, he overcame that, and he found another mentor, an Apollo. That's pretty cool. So that's my bit on Chiron and Aries. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
It's interesting listening to what you're saying. It seems like Chiron and Aries is very much an opportunity to, for lack of a better way of saying it, embrace your wounds, to really look at your wounds. How have they made you who you are? Maybe part of the strength of who you are, deep, important parts of your personalities have to do with how you've been wounded and how you've either overcome them or lived with them or healed them, especially with Aries being such a sign of, I am. And especially if you embrace this, I will not be branded, I am unique, I am realizing the self. It can be very challenging, and it can be very not so always comfortable to look at the wounds and embrace them. But by doing so, you do set yourself free. And so often wounds, it's interesting how we think, oh my God, I've been wounded by this thing. We've all been through things, and we all move on. We all live our lives. I mean, we can all point to things that have happened to us. Some wounds are deeper than others. Some things are more substantial than others, but we live our lives and we go on. And so this would be an interesting time. My Aries is in Chiron, or my Chiron is in Aries. So we will see how it affects me. I'll report back.
Yeah, we'll be talking more about it since it's going to be there for quite a while.
Yes.
So Michael, did you want to tell us about upcoming shows before we get into the meat of the matter tonight?
Sure. We've got some really cool stuff coming up. Now, next week, we're not quite sure what we're doing just yet. We had a little have to juggle a couple of shows based on an issue we had with one of our guests, and he'll be on again later. Krista's dad, there were some technical issues, and we're doing that one by phone, so we're going to have to sort that out. So we'll be rescheduling him for a couple of weeks from now. So, we're talking to a couple of different guests. We may have a guest next week, or we may just come up with a cool topic. But check the website about Wednesday, and by then we'll have it up what we're going to be doing. The following week, the 10th, I think it is, we have Rick McCallum, one of the founders of Hollywood Ghost Hunters. And it's going to be really cool. We're going to talk about, he's been doing ghost hunting since long before ghost hunting was a thing. And we're going to talk about his experiences. He's traveled all over the world to England and Ireland and Scotland and Germany and all over the U.S., hunting ghosts. And he's a real character. So we had a very wonderful conversation on the phone, so I'm super looking forward to him. And then the lodge where we tape our show is haunted, we believe. So after, we're going to stick around and do a ghost hunt. Maybe we'll document some of that and put it up on the website for you folks. But we'll see how that goes. It should be a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to see what happens. And then the following week, we have an author coming up that's going to talk about the shadow side. And maybe Krista, I know she's been talking to her, so maybe Krista can give us a little background on that show.
Well, the one thing I know, she wrote a book, and I've been reading some of it, and part of the book is about her own coming to terms with, the first part of it, her own shadow side. And so far I'm in sort of the childhood side, and she also wants to, help others and inspire women. So it's also a part journal where she asks questions at the end of a chapter. So it looks like it's going to be really good. I really like the book so far, and really think she's being quite honest and truthful, which I like. So that's a little bit I know about it. And of course, we'll talk maybe some in general what we think about the shadow, and that's an important topic certainly for the New Age people in the metaphysical movement, because sometimes people are, think you always have to be too positive and you're not supposed to have any negative thoughts, or that's a little crazy.
Unfortunately, I don't have her name in front of me, so maybe Krista can give you guys that information.
Yeah, it was Mabel. I think it was Mabel Rodriguez. I'm not sure though. I didn't bring it.
I think that's correct, yes. And Lit is the name of the book, and it's like working with your shadow side or something, but Lit is the name of the book. And again, she's going to be fun. She'll be here on the 17th. And we're lining up some other guests for down the road, and Krista's dad will be on again in March, and we hope we'll have all the tech stuff sorted out by then to do the phone interview. But that's about it. So I'm going to kick it back to you guys, and let's have a go at the wonderful topic of Magickal Wars tonight. And I can't wait to hear what you guys have to say.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Well, when we first started to do this talk, I decided to delve into a book I'd bought just recently, even though it's been out for a while, and it's called The Magical Battle of Britain, The War Letters of Dion Fortune, and it's edited by Gareth Knight. And when I started reading it, I didn't really know what I was getting into, and it's a fabulous look at what an esoteric group can do to fight on the astral plane. So I highly recommend it for that reason. But the more I thought about the topic and sort of looked at other YouTube stories about it, the more I realized just how prevalent and important this topic is. And there are different various levels from personal to, I want to start with the historical battle, because it's pretty impressive. So most people know that Hitler's war was occult, and they used the occult to help them win over Germany through sort of appealing to their subconscious mind as a nation, as well as literally using magic and sigils and astrology to try to win the war. And most of us are aware of that side of it. So we may not be as aware of the British people's fight on several levels. And that wasn't just Dion Fortune, her group, but there was also Aleister Crowley, and there were some witches that did some things as well. So I'm going to touch base on, I'm going to mostly spend time with Dion Fortune's book because it's so fascinating and detailed about what they did. So she had a fraternity. It's now called I think the Society of Inner Light. And at that time it was already formed. And so it was in the beginning of October of 1939, 1 month after the outbreak of war, that she started sending out these letters, weekly letters and meditations to all of her members. She also opened up the group to people that did not necessarily have the training of the inner circle, because it was that important to her. So there were people in the group that didn't have some of the experiences some of the other people did. but she felt that was fine to do. So each week these letters would go out. Wednesday they'd get there. Sunday there was a specific time for a meditation at the place that they were holding the it was called I think it was a sanctuary at 3 Queensborough Terrace, and there was a united meditation every Sunday at 12:15. So they would then look at the topic for the week, and they had a very formal sort of meditation that they built up over time, and a visualization to get information and to open up the spiritual channels. And then also each person would go home and at the same time and same hour that they would pick each day between week to week, they would work with that one idea. And this was done over a period of 3 years. So that's a lot of dedication there to begin with. I would also suggest, if you're really interested to see how they did it, to buy the book. Again, it's called The Magical Battle of Britain, because the first letter itself, it breaks down the different stages of the meditation practice and the visualization. And there's also some other really interesting things about how to work on the astral plane. So anyway, the point was the group was trying to open a channel whereby the spiritual influences could contact the group mind of the race. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what she means by the group mind of the race. And there were times where she would report to the group confirmations of things that had happened. So for instance, there was a meeting held on a Sunday morning, October 1st, in their sanctuary, where they had a specific meditation and teachings there. And then it was basically, or maybe it wasn't October 1st, I got the date wrong. But anyway, they'd had a specific conversation about something that they wanted to influence leaders. And like 3 days later, the Archbishop said exactly what was said in that room. So the idea was that they were going to be influences, and they were not necessarily engaging directly in political attacks and things like that. So that was, and she gave a couple examples of that, and saying that it wasn't to brag, but to show that it actually works. And you can say it's circumstantial, but some of it was pretty interesting and detailed. I do believe in sort of synchronicities and things like that anyway. So basically, they were using a technique of symbol making, where they would use the imagination to build up symbols, and the symbols eventually became astral forms, and they would actually maintain themselves, according to Dion Fortune, on their own. If we'd had more time, I would basically even tell you there was a really beautiful image and that they built up over time. It was called, let me get the name of it so you can kind of look it up online. I think it was the illumination, the 3-chambered mount of illumination. It's a complex imagery that has a cavern, and you go into the cavern, and then there's other places built on top of it. And this is what they would build up on a regular basis until it kind of had its own volition, and they would get information from the masters. And it really is a beautiful visualization, and I'm not sure why it's considered to be a very important glyph, but it is, so you could probably use it in other ways. One of the areas of the visualization that is really cool is called the Watchtower. So evidently, if you went on the Watchtower, you had to be pretty good with the occult, because you could see on the Watchtower the play out of good and evil. And that was, if you weren't prepared, you could have a psychic attack up there. So there's evidently a watcher up there, and it sounds like very much like, Lord of the Rings or something, a lot of it. But it was very serious, and I don't want to make light of it. So I was very impressed by that. They did that in a consistent level. Also, remember, she stayed in England with, and a lot of her people did too, while there was the bombing. And they were not injured by the bombing, but twice the place they were holding the meditations it was actually bombed. And so it was pretty courageous of her to keep doing that amidst all that sort of bombing. So what I mentioned earlier, that there is this idea of the group mind. And there's two things. There's the group mind, there's the group soul. So there's the group soul has to do with the subconsciousness of, according to her, of a nation. And according to her, that is where the archetypes rise up from. That's where you have symbols and dreams of that particular nation. And it's been created over a very long period of time. So whereas the group mind is more the consciousness of the country, and that's more influenced by, day-to-day things. It's more changeable, and it's important to know the difference between the two. So what they were trying to do basically was influence both, but definitely to appeal to the group soul and what was the archetype of the nation, including sort of appealing to ancient English history and things like King Arthur and the archetypes from that. So that was what they did with their meditation. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and this might, relate to some of what you're going to talk about a little bit, is she talks about the use of subversive telepathy by certainly anyone, and certainly the Nazis could have used it too. And she really felt that they were dealing with definite occult forces being used telepathically on group souls of nations, and finding channels of expressions through the subconsciousness of susceptible people who lack spiritual principle. So she gives also some examples of it, of some secrets that were sort of stolen and sort of why, and it was pretty interesting. But she said one of the things that helps to prevent being influenced by that kind of telepathy is by having really strong spiritual principles, clearly realized ideals, and dedicating yourself to them even to death. So if you feel, since we're in a nation right now where we will talk about this part too, memes and thought forms are being put upon us through the news, through the internet, remember that your ideals and spiritual principles can help to inoculate against the influence of them. So I thought that was a really good, simple thing you can do. And then I don't think there's any more I wanted to say about her, though I did have a lot more notes here. But I was just very impressed that they were so dedicated over a 3-year period to helping, and I really think it did help. There was also, they would have these patrols where they would envision these archangels and angels basically patrolling Britain and going across the sea. But it was a very specified ritual, and they really visualized the land, they knew the map, so all of this required a lot of, clear visualization in a sense to succeed. So that was their end of it. The next one I'm just gonna mention a couple brief ones before I go over to Kristen. Is one was called the Operation Cone of Power. Now I'd heard about this one I think in one of Laurie Cabot's books years ago, and though I got this information from an article by Tom Metcalf in Mental Floss, and it was about the summer of 1940 at the town of Highcliffe-on-Sea. There was a group of witches who arranged to meet on the eve of Lammas, which, as you know, is August 1st, to do a ritual to fight Hitler. And according to Gerald Gardner in his books, these witches, they were later known as the New Forest Coven of Witches. They did a ritual where they directed the cone of power at Hitler's mind and said, "You cannot cross the sea." And he did stop. That is a true thing. So it is possible they could have been at least part of the influence. So it always reminds me of the Lord of the Rings and Gandalf, "You shall not cross," or "shall not pass," that great scene with the Balrog. So anyway, Gardner also claimed, interesting enough, I didn't know this, that 2 other times in English history, magic was used to stop an invasion. The first was in 1588 to stop the Spanish Armado, and the second in 1805 to stop Napoleon. So that was really, really cool. So you had something interesting, I think, that relates a little to maybe not telepathy, but government and...
Well, the government to this day is working with psychics. And, I read some very interesting research about, even from the 1920s, this was established with Russia. So it's established in the 1920s, and all the way up and through the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of psychics running tests and doing remote viewing so they could sort of be spies without being spies, so to speak, which I thought was a really interesting concept. So they were trying to remote view. And this is something, and they talk a lot about in the military about soldiers having a sort of sixth sense and sort of knowing what to do. It's very interesting. It's very powerful, and it's just something that is not really shared with us, the general public, and it's something that we all have. It's a power that we all actually have and can work. You know, but is it to work it for the light side or for the shadow side? So it's very interesting stuff. I love these stories about Dion Fortune, because I do believe in it's the power of the mind, really, and that's part of magic. It's heart magic, it's soul magic, mind magic. I love how, you know, he just didn't cross the sea.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, and that's the evidence right there.
Right.
Now, it's who's to say whether they were a part of it or it was totally them. But isn't that part of magic, that doesn't have to necessarily be just the spell you cast per se. It is the divine timing of several things intersecting at once that can cause an event to happen or not to happen.
Yeah, it's a cumulative thing, and it seems like the Hitler used that kind of technique of the group energy, and I think that the other thing that was interesting about Dion Fortune in that book, she said that the Nazis had the ability to create on the astral plane, but they did not have spiritual contacts, which I thought was, I kind of wondered what she meant by that. I said, well, doesn't evil have spiritual contacts? But she said that was why it had to also be won. In fact, she said it had to be won on the spiritual plane.
Right.
And it was certainly, I think, an occult war. I mean, for sure. And of course, all the other stuff mattered, which, by the way, Dion Fortune said, you still need to go out and do normal things to help. She didn't say just, you know, do this work and don't worry about the war effort or help out. She said, no, this is only part of it, really.
But he was definitely working some sort of magic. But I wonder if he really knew what he was doing per se on the astral plane.
Well, some of his people did,
right?
Because Crowley got involved in this, and Crowley supposedly deliberately gave him false information on star charts, and so they were using astrology, and they were all into, you know, the spear of destiny. So, according to Dion Fortune's own psychic look at Hitler, she thought he was a natural medium. On top of it,
he would have had to have been psychic to really have that kind of power over so many people, to really put people in a trance like that. And it happens today. You know, I mean, come on, look at the TV and the different things that were being shown on the news. But also the kind of, I mean, I don't know, I'm going to sound really maybe controversial to some people here, but I just think that some of these reality television shows are definitely meant to kind of distract us. And to sort of kind of sculpt how we feel life should be, you know. It's quite powerful. And if you'll notice, World War II was when the media really did begin to influence us. You know, I know that people were seeing the films coming back and these propaganda films that were made by Hitler,
right?
And they were highly influential. You know, it kind of also reminds me of the Vietnam War, where the news really affected people for the first time because they could literally see body bags coming in. Like back in World War II, they weren't actually at that point where they were showing the dead coming through because people just didn't do that back then. It was not part of the culture. But, you know, by the time the Vietnam War came, people were seeing the dead. They were seeing the body bags, and it had a huge influence, actually, I think, for the better in that case, because we were able to be affected and be like, whoa, this isn't something that we can't see, hear, taste, touch, feel. When I see that image, it goes of these multiple body bags, it's going through my body. I'm feeling something. We want to stand up and do something against this. Right? Whereas in World War II, it was very different. It was very much, we were being kind of shown what people wanted us to see in that propaganda. And the media is magical. I mean, this is sort of kind of giving me that insight of how it can really be used in that way. But I did not know that Hitler used astrology and had astrologers and people coming in. And I would love to hear a little bit more about Aleister Crowley going to see him.
I didn't have as much time to do Aleister Crowley, but I will say I listened to a really good podcast on occulture, and the host is Ryan Peverly, and it was episode 17. This is a shout out for his podcast because it's a great podcast. He interviews Douglas Rushkoff, who had at that point just put out his graphic novel called Aleister and Adolf.
Oh, how cool.
And it's based on truth, you know,
Yes.
even though it's a graphic novel. And I looked at some of the pictures. They're fantastic. It's by artist Michael, I think it's Oeming. I don't know how you pronounce that. He's a famous artist in that
Okay.
world. But Oeming, excuse me, I'm sorry. But in this podcast, Rushkoff says about the graphic novel that he was interested when he did it in the way the tools of fascism ended up migrating into advertising specifically,
Yes.
and media and culture. And he's big on the media and culture as a rule. And as a result, it's a really fascinating look and talk about how we have been influenced even now with sigil magic through corporations.
Well, I mean, you look at branding, so to speak. I mean, and honestly, anybody can do this. You can go on Fiverr. I mean, I've done it myself, and you can like get yourself branded. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody that goes on Fiverr and gets their, you know, their new company that they're starting at home, you're trying to like wield negative magic on people. But you know, when you see certain things coming at you all the time, I mean, certain branding I think is quite subversive. I mean, it's when you look at it, you know, whether it's meant to be or not by the people who originated it. You know, I mean, that's what they always say about, like, you know, ad men. Is the reason why it was called Mad Men. You know, there's a reason, you know, so it's look at the McDonald's arches even. That's, for some reason, that's coming through. Just how religious it kind of is, which I never thought about until this very moment.
Well, and also a little bit about Crowley. He actually did meet Hitler several times, evidently. And he was not only involved in the propaganda against Hitler in World War II, but also World War I. So I think the V is for victory comes from Crowley in World War II, and that's well known. And I guess I really, you know, I think if you even just look at the graphic novel, you'll see some of the things with the star charts. And certainly there's a lot out there about Aleister Crowley. Though some people don't think he really was involved, but I think he was based on what my research. And so the main thing, the argument was that really World War II is not only important historically, according to this podcast, but its influence in us today. And I mean, even look at the rise of fascism. And the irony is that we're, you know, maybe not in a World War III at this point, but we have this rise of fascism and the fake news and the use of memes that really destroy things deliberately. So I think it's a really important thing to know how magic works so that you will not be unconsciously affected by it. And also, of course, watching what you watch.
Right.
And being really careful what you put, you know, your minds into. And unfortunately, I don't think we do that enough as a culture. You know, we don't realize that all of that's really affecting our subconscious and appealing to the deeper subconscious, whether it's the negative part of us or the positive part. So
I've had friends that have literally gone crazy watching the news. I'm serious. During our last election, after our last election, I knew several people that just were so addicted to the news. But as we know, there's so much fake news going on, and they got addicted to watching a lot of the conspiracy theory stuff, which normally I'm all up into that stuff. But even that is I think constructed to sort of distract people and to actually make them kind of go a little nuts. I mean, it could even be the right some of that stuff just to kind of distract people. It's very interesting. Friends of mine that just literally would literally hit the refresh button on the news over and over and over again and be watching all these things and just not knowing what to believe and kind of going a little bit nuts, and to the point where they couldn't really think straight. And I was like, you just need to not watch the news right now. I know you want to be informed and I understand, but you really need to detox. And I'm not suggesting that every single person that watches the news is going nuts, but I understand what Krista is saying about you kind of, we all just need to take a deep breath sometimes and look at what we're watching and to put it in perspective.
I think it's really interesting that, you know, coming back to World War II again quickly, I don't know if Krista mentioned this or ran across it, but, and I think that there are the conflicts, but then there are all these layers, and you have the magical layer underneath the physical layer and so forth. And of course, we know that Germany was very into the occultism just by their uniforms and whatnot. They was very open about it. And But in England, as you were saying, there was a lot going on there too. And I don't know if our viewers know this, but Churchill was a Druid. And when he was in university, he belonged to a Druid grove. So there's no doubt that there was a deep occult battle going on underneath the surface of this sort of outward conflict as well, which is fascinating. And, you know, the government, you're right. I mean, to this day, that they've experimented with remote viewing. There's a whole department in the CIA that I'm sure wages war with psychological, you know, operations and tries to influence people's minds. And that's a magical thing. That's the idea of trying to, you know, get people to think a certain way or believe a certain thing. And so there's all kinds of stuff like that going on. And I think it's really fascinating to think about that. And it makes you wonder how many other conflicts that we have. Are there a lot of occult magical things going on underneath of that layer as well?
And that's probably one of the reasons why both Crowley and Dion Fortune wanted people to know how magic worked so they could choose to be influenced or not, rather than, because they both were really big on opening up magical theory to everyone to some degree, even though I think Dion Fortune sort of pulled back after the war and into the inner circle again. But she published things, you know, that made it available. And I do recommend that. The reason I recommend that particular book is because it's a really good introduction, but it's in detail about how to build on the astral plane, these symbols, and I was really affected just actually reading the book. They're very powerful, the letters.
Yeah.
And they also, each of the letters, if you look in the back of the book, they have the phrase that they're meant to be concentrating on that week. So you can kind of see what it was, and then she talks about it. And so you get the whole teaching with that as well. But let's go on to a little more personal battles. And this is probably something most people that work in metaphysics can really relate to, whether you're a psychic, a healer, astrologer. I know that there are these sort of, Michael called them skirmishes, I guess. They're not necessarily major battles like in, you know, a whole country involved in it. And we want to talk a little bit about maybe an example of that. And I did want to ask Michael, because he had a really good story about something that happened to him early on when he was reading tarot on the boardwalk in Venice.
Yeah, it was really kind of interesting. We just moved here, and it was the winter time, and it was raining a lot. And the Venice boardwalk, when we were doing readings down there, was kind of law of the jungle to begin with. But the area where I used to set up, it kind of flooded out. And again, it was wintertime. There wasn't really that many people out there or anything. So I'd moved my setup down about a block, and there was another reader that was at the other end of the block. And he and I were just totally different worlds. He was pretty scruffy, and the clientele he would have attracted was going to be very different than the people who were going to get a reading from me, and vice versa. So we really weren't competing with each other in a true sense. But after a while, I was setting up there, and I started to feel just that something was wrong. You know, you could feel this energy that was just off, and you know, and it became obvious that someone was kind of sending us the evil eye, if you will. So I decided at some point I'd had enough of it. And now, one of the things that I think with, you know, don't hold back. If you're going to fight a war, you know, you have to bring your energy, and you have to really put your energy into it. So I did a ritual, and at the time our goddess, and still that we are fond of, was the Morrigan, the Irish battle goddess, Celtic battle goddess. And she's a shapeshifter, and one of her shapes that she'll shift into is the raven on the battlefield. So I did this whole ritual where I didn't want to accuse anyone because I didn't know who it was. And there was one reader that I suspected that it was, but I didn't know for sure, and I didn't want to accuse him. So I basically just did this ritual and psyched up all of my anger and all of my energy to the highest level I could. And I said, this is unfair. This energy you're directing is not our energy. It's your energy. Take it back. And I just sort of energetically pushed it back to wherever it was coming from. So, and part of the ritual was that your enemy is supposed to reveal themselves. So the next day I'm down on the beach, and the reader I thought was the guy that didn't like us comes along, and he's whistling and happy, and he stops and tells me how much he appreciates me and everything else. I thought, well, that's odd. And then this guy, the scruffy guy that was sitting at the other end of the block, I go over to, you know, just say good morning to him, and he's angry. It's like, get out of here. And he's all upset at me. And I thought, ooh, that is very interesting. So that day I had like the best time of my life. I was getting all kinds of readings. I was making all kinds of money. I had a porn star sit down that was half naked. It was awesome. It was just, it was the perfect day. And I look up at him, and he's literally like, you know, 200 feet away. And he's got drunks fighting on top of him. The cops are there breaking it up. They're smashing up all his stuff. And there was a strong breeze coming in out of the ocean off the beach. And sailing in the wind above him, about 40 feet above his head, just kind of floating, was this magnificent raven, just kind of watching everything. And at that point, he packed up and he left the beach, and I honestly didn't see him again for the next 4 years. I don't know where he went, but he just disappeared. So I guess we knew who was sending the evil energy, and I guess the spell worked. So that's kind of like a personal magical war, if you will. And again, I certainly didn't pick a war with anyone, but I do believe if you're attacked, you have to defend yourself, and I certainly didn't hesitate to do that.
Yeah, I always thought the raven part was amazing because you can't make that happen. I mean, it's like, and the ravens are not as common, by the way, as like the crows are around here. They're not, some areas have more ravens than others. So that was the other thing. It was unusual. Do you have any personal stories of even subtle attacks or negative energy and how you handled it, or?
Thinking about it, an ex-boyfriend. And I think a lot of us can maybe identify with this, where sometimes you can feel someone's negative energy on you for a number of years, where someone just doesn't really let go of the anger, and really just needing to sort of acknowledge it. I mean, I think a lot of times we don't really quite know. We just are like, well, something feels off, and you don't quite know what it is. Like, how come I can't really heal from this situation? I think sometimes when you sometimes you can't get over someone, and it's that. But I really do think that sometimes in a relationship, when someone's hanging on to their anger and to the anger towards you, it really can prevent both of you from letting go and from healing. Mm-hmm. So I think, when I think of something, I had an experience with an ex that did that, and I really actually had to purge it on my own. And I did some deep work within a shamanistic ceremony where I was able to purge it. And that person, actually, it was interesting as I saw his face in front of me. And then I saw him kind of disintegrating, and it was very, very interesting. But I think that that's something for all of us to be aware of in relationship, when you just feel like, or sometimes you feel like, you've been ghosted by someone, but the energy just doesn't get shaken off. And I think that's where a good cord cutting experience might be able to help, if that works for you. I think it's important to protect ourselves on a daily basis and work with medicine. Animal totems are wonderful for this. I know after that experience, I actually was working with I was seeing the image of like this sort of like kind of ugly black shield. And what I realized is that it was roach medicine, because they're just such survivors, and they're so strong that I literally felt over areas of my very vulnerable areas of my body, this sort of roach medicine working for me. Another great way is to take a selenite crystal and rub your body down with it, sage yourself. But yeah, nothing as fantastical as I have to say that raven story is pretty cool, because there you did a ritual to the Morgan and the raven came up. But I feel like when my personal experiences have been with relationships where people just are hanging on to the energy, they just don't seem to really move on, and they kind of drag their sort of darkness or their sort of that onto you. And it's difficult to shake it off. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very common one, actually.
I think that there's, I was saying to Krista, I think there's magical skirmishes and magical wars, and they're very different.
Yes.
I think some people, obviously, they're a little jealous or whatever.
Right.
And you're going to feel that sort of negative energy, but it's not particularly strong, and it's not going to really mess with you all that bad. But then there are cases where you have that person that does really go to war with you.
Absolutely.
They really hate you on a deep level.
Yes.
They direct a ton of negative energy at you. It's palpable. You can feel it. And that's a whole different ball game, and just the magnitude of it. And so, and those things will often run their course over time too, because it's hard for people to sustain that energy year after year after year. But it can definitely cause a lot of problems.
It's true, and
Absolutely.
actually, in psychic self-defense, Deanne Fortune tells her own story as a young woman of some woman she worked with who she thinks probably knew some magic, but she didn't know that she knew this magic, and she was a very angry, controlling woman who got her way by basically controlling people. And she basically had a breakdown because of something this woman did to her. And I was rereading it recently, and Deanne Fortune kind of started standing up for some of the people that this woman was trying to basically take advantage of. One was an older woman who she's trying to get her money from her, and she kind of stood up for this old woman and got the old woman out. And after that, the woman, she went into the office to quit, and the woman looks at her, and she thinks Deanne Fortune thinks that she had some ability with hypnosis. And she literally said for over 4 hours, "You are incompetent and know it. You have no self-confidence, and you have got to admit it." Now, you'd think that she's only 20, but she put her in this kind of state. And we all know what that kind of directed criticism can do. Imagine if it's sustained for that long.
Right.
She had a breakdown after that. It took her a while to figure out what it was, I think, and she got really ill. And she initially couldn't even remember what had happened.
Right.
And remember, she's only like 20 years old. And I personally, the more I thought about this topic, the more I realized I've been in some kind of skirmish most of my life. Though there was one or two that I don't know if they were people. And I'll tell you why. When I was like about 7 or 8, we lived in this home that was haunted. I talked about this a little, where I saw a ghost. But I'd have these terrible nightmares of a vampire, but I could feel the vampire on my body, like a weight on my chest. And that is one of the symptoms, according to Deanne Fortune, of a psychic attack at night. I've never had anything like that since. It was terrifying.
Yeah.
And I would hide underneath my blanket, and I would put all my stuffed animals around me at night, like a little circle to protect me. My dad tried to help me. It was a creepy, creepy house.
Yeah.
And the only other time I had this spiritually, a vampire attack, was when I was working really hard on improving myself. And I was living alone next to a cemetery, and I started having such bad vampire dreams. I would go into work, and the woman was spiritual, and she'd say, "What is wrong with you? You look terrible." And I was just like drained completely of my energy. So I actually ended up going to an energy healer who really helped me. And he worked with the Christ consciousness, which is one of the, even if you're not Christian, you can call on the Christ consciousness for spiritual help, and it really works. And because that's what he worked on, and it really, he really helped me so much. And that just doing the energy work. And so don't be afraid to get help. Like I had to get help at one point because I worked really hard on my own. I meditated. I did all kinds of things. And also, you know, you want to find a way to identify if it really is a psychic attack, because sometimes it could be an illness, like a real illness. You want to make sure you're not sick.
Right.
Or it can be a mental imbalance that you need to be treated for. So you have to figure out if it is or not.
Right. I mean, and like, you know, you might feel yucky about a particular thing, and there's a difference.
Yeah.
And I know from the experience that I was talking about, I mean, this particular person hated me. I mean, there was literally, because I had a mutual friend who was actually on my behalf trying to calm him down.
Wow.
Because he hated me so much that he would rant on and on and on. And the person was a little bit mentally unstable. He really was. And just directing a lot of negative energy. To the point where I couldn't get over it. I mean, it was, you know, I needed help. So yes, there is definitely, you know, sometimes you have a breakup and someone's jealous, but if somebody really wants to affect you, I mean, I know for a fact that this guy didn't think I'm putting a spell on her. I'm psychically attacking her, but through just his own mental issue and negative behavior, when you put that much energy towards someone, it's going to affect. I mean, you can do that with love, and you can do it with hate. You can do it with love or fear.
Actually, I think one of the worst times is if it's a partner, a sexual partner,
right,
or a family member. That's where the jealousy and the hatred is obviously more effective. So the fact that you'd been involved, that makes you
Right.
even more kind of open and vulnerable because you'd had, that connection with that person.
Absolutely.
And there are some easy kind of things you can do for basic protection. Like, see, I'm wearing my scarf with the hamsas. That really does help, having that. One of the things, since psychic attack can happen at night when you're sleeping, and you can tell by certain kinds of nightmares or if you're drained a lot. So there's a simple remedy called sleeping with water. You just put a glass of water every night by your head if possible. Actually, you should put it by your head. And you never use that glass for anything else. And you just put it there. In the morning, you take your left hand and you flush it down the toilet, and then 3 times more you pour water in after it. And that really helps with attacks. And I started doing it because I still have a tendency to be prone to being open to nightmares and things, and it really helped. It also helped someone I mentioned it to another reader, and she said it changed her life. And
Wow.
because she's really sensitive, and she thanked me, and I said I was just talking about how I liked it. And another friend of mine, he said he just slept better. And so it's a very old folk remedy. It's cheap and expensive, and to me it works most of the time for those kinds of attacks at night. Whether it's a random thing. Sometimes living in LA, I think we get random negative energy that just comes through and sort of bumps your psyche, or whether it's a deliberate thing, or even sometimes I'll notice our neighborhood's going through something. And then you
Absolutely.
pick up on the vibes in the neighborhood.
It doesn't have to even be intentional towards you. It literally could be, especially, I mean, if you do live in a big city, there's just a lot of vibration and a lot of low vibration that has nothing to do with you. And you will, if you're a sensitive person, you will pick up on what's going on in your neighborhood, what's going on in your city, and it's important to, I always think wearing some sort of crystal is very helpful. Anything dark is going to be very protective. But any kind of, I know I carry like tourmaline in my pocket or in my purse. I know a lot of people that do that and they swear by it. If there's a particular crystal that you really identify with, that could be very helpful as well. I keep dark crystals all over my house, actually, and also white crystals. I love selenite, and that's a very powerful crystal that is actually very much about directing light, and covering the dark with light. So it's sort of like you can actually crystal grid your house.
No, that's a good idea.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, I came across that a couple of years ago, but you can actually crystal grid your house. And I was really upset because I had black stones outside my front door, and like for a long time, and then they got taken, and I was like,
They did their duty, I guess.
It did, and actually I've heard of that. I've actually had several friends who really work with crystals quite powerfully say that all of a sudden a crystal literally that's on their body will just disappear, or something they have in their pocket or their purse. You might say, oh yeah, they probably just lost it and didn't know. No, it just disintegrated. Sometimes it just does its work and then it goes away. That is not unusual at all. But yes, I was, and it's funny because I haven't put them back out there since then. So maybe they did do their job. But I also have a hemsa on my front door as well, which is a wonderful thing for anyone to do. I mean, some basic things you can do around your house, a hemsa on the front door. Also, the lucky tree or the bamboo tree. Now, I know that they're associated with luck and money and that sort of thing, but it's, having these specific plants can actually, especially bamboo, can be very protective.
Yeah, amulets really do work pretty well. The Nazar, it's called, the amulet, which is the eye, the blue eye that everybody sees from Turkey. They're really beautiful. And there's this man on the boardwalk that I think he's still there. He gets them from Turkey, these beautiful braided hamsas and the eye, the Nazar, together. And so I bought one just for fun to put over our door because I thought it looked really pretty. And I said, well, this will be good luck. So I think it was the weekend after I put it up, our business went crazy at the bookstore. We actually had too much business that weekend. It was the first time my naive self said, oh, I guess there's some people that don't really like me being successful. And it didn't matter who they were. It doesn't matter necessarily. Right. I mean, I think maybe it can be if you're in a battle matter. If it's unconscious, then it doesn't really matter who it's coming from. And I guess you do have to be careful to make sure you really know like in Michael's case, who it's coming from. It's better maybe not to. But if you do, sometimes people have open magical wars in the witchcraft community. And that's just part of it, you know, and some of it. So they know they're kind of throwing at each other, which is too bad. But it does happen. And honestly, the more I thought about it, it's part of the spiritual world, magical warfare. And it's something we have to be educated about, understand it, and see, you know, what we can do to avoid wars where possible, or battles or skirmishes or whatever you want to call them. And then, you know, not run away from them and not back down from them, because, you know, it's okay to stand up to these energies. It's not okay just to take it. You know, it's not right.
One of the things that I'd love to do as a show, and maybe we'll do it in a couple of weeks because it ties into so much of what we're talking about tonight, is the whole concept of curses as well. And there are some very famous ones out there, but because again, that's sort of one of the weapons that you would employ in a magical war. So how to protect yourself from all of that, whatnot. We probably should do a whole show on that. So maybe in a few weeks, if you guys tune in. Real quick before we're wrapping up, I apologize to everybody who's watching tonight. The gremlins were horrible. We've had all kinds of little technical glitches, and I've tried my best to keep it going.
It's
so
early Mercury retrograde.
Something going on. So we're gonna
the opening song, opening theme song somehow went crazy too.
So we're going to we do record the show, not just stream it live. So we'll upload the recorded one. So it should be much better than what you guys heard. And if you did miss any of it, if your internet was weird, then tune back in and give it another listen, and our podcast, of course, will be perfect. And just to remind people now, we're on Spotify and iTunes and Google Play as a podcast, so you can listen to our show on there as well while you're driving in the car and everything. So I'll kick it back to you guys, and we're getting ready to wrap up. And thank you guys so much for being patient with me tonight, and we managed to keep it together and get through it, and with cameras crashing and internet crashing and everything else. But here we are, so good luck.
Well, let's see. Anything else I'd like to add? Maybe a couple of the symptoms of like these attacks that are unconscious or
how does
based
a person
on jealousy.
know if it's a real attack
well,
or if they're just kind of feeling bad?
Evidently, certain kinds of pressure headaches can be a sign of it, and a deep fatigue, like you're always tired. Sometimes if you wake up in the morning thinking of somebody, you know, that, and it's not a good experience on a consistent basis, that can be part of it as well. For me, certain kinds of nightmares indicate, some of them I can tell are my psychology kind of working itself out, and some of them I have learned to see are not, they don't seem like normal nightmares. So, for instance, right before 9/11, this isn't so much me, but I heard that many people had these terrible nightmares about a week before, and unfortunately nobody knew exactly why. And one woman came to see me. She was a psychic, and she had a breakdown right before then. Psychically, it was just so intense, and but I don't think people could process what was going on. They knew that they didn't understand it, but. But to tell you the truth, when Bush went into office, both my mother and I started having continual nightmares, constantly. And so now I'm aware if it's a lot, I better think of what's going on in the outside world. And, you know, we talk about it. But again, I just thought it was me, you know, and I've had more nightmares than normal, you know, whatever it was.
Well, this is an interesting idea that if you're empathic or just a sensitive person or someone who works as an energy healer, a psychic, that there are just people putting out, whether it's a curse or having a magical war against all people who are working within the light or all psychics. And it's not even personal to you. There's just someone trying to attack and block all people that are trying to actually use these more alternative ways to help people in the world heal.
Yeah, there's definitely obstacles to being good in the world, and it's just part of the path. And so embrace it and study it, and thank you for watching, and I hope you tune in for our next show. Like us if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe to us, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week.
Bye.